She's gone. The words landed in the hospital room like a sentence nobody in it was prepared to hear. The little girl lay perfectly still beneath the white sheets, her small chest no longer rising. Her mother had already slid down the wall, one hand pressed over her own mouth to keep the sound in. A nurse stood frozen beside the monitor, watching the flat green line with the particular stillness of someone who had seen this exact moment too many times to still know how to react to it. The doctor peeled off his gloves slowly, methodically, the way people do things with their hands when they can't yet bring themselves to look up. Then the door opened. A man stood in the doorway, soaked through from the rain outside, his beard untrimmed, one hand wrapped in a strip of old cloth that had clearly served as a bandage more than once. Two security guards were already moving toward him from the hallway, their pace picking up the moment they registered exactly what he was, the kind of man hospitals had signs specifically posted to keep out. But the man wasn't looking at the guards, or the doctor, or the mother crumpled against the wall. He was looking at the little girl. He walked past all of them, unhurried, and stopped beside her bed. He stood there for several long seconds, studying her face with an intensity that made the nurse forget, briefly, to call out for security to remove him. Then he leaned down, close enough that his breath must have stirred the small, still strands of hair against her temple, and whispered something. Something so quiet that only the girl, if she could have heard anything at all, should ever have been able to make it out. The doctor stopped moving. The nurse turned, sharp and sudden, her hand still hovering over the monitor. Even the girl's father, who had been standing frozen by the window for the last 4 minutes, unable to make himself walk any closer to the bed, looked up. Because the 5 words that stranger had just whispered weren't the kind of thing an ordinary person off the street should have known to say. They weren't comfort. They weren't a prayer. They were a name and a phrase tied to a secret buried 7 years deep, a secret that, if it was true, would unmake everything this family had spent 7 years believing about what had actually happened to their daughter. And the homeless man standing over her bed knew exactly what those words meant, because he was the only other person alive who had ever needed to say them before. Stay with this one to the very end, because those 5 words are about to reopen a case nobody in that hospital ever wanted reopened. 7 years earlier, the man in the doorway had a name everyone in that hospital would have recognized instantly. Dr. Marcus Hale had spent 11 years as an attending physician in County General's pediatric cardiac unit, the kind of doctor other doctors quietly deferred to in a crisis, the kind of doctor parents specifically requested by name once word got around. He'd built that reputation the hard way, working double shifts through his residency while raising his daughter Emily alone after his wife died of postpartum complications 3 days after Emily was born, a loss so early and so total that Marcus had sometimes joked, in the dark, self-deprecating way exhausted single fathers joke about things too painful to say plainly, that fatherhood and grief had arrived for him on the exact same afternoon and had never fully separated since. Emily had been born with a congenital heart defect, the kind that required careful lifelong monitoring, and Marcus had raised her with the particular, hyper-attentive love of a father who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how fragile the thing he loved most actually was. She was 8 years old, funny and sharp-tongued in a way that reminded him constantly of her mother, when County General's board approved a new clinical trial for a promising cardiac medication, fast-tracked and heavily funded by a pharmaceutical partner with deep ties to the hospital's chairman, a man named Gerald Voss. Marcus had been cautious about the trial from the start, flagging concerns in 2 separate committee meetings about the abbreviated safety testing timeline, concerns that were noted, thanked for, and quietly set aside. When Emily's own cardiologist, not Marcus, hospital policy barred him from treating his own daughter, suggested she might be a strong candidate for the trial given her specific defect, Marcus had agonized for 2 weeks before finally, trusting the institution he devoted his career to, agreeing to enroll her. 6 weeks into the trial, Emily suffered a catastrophic reaction the drug's own internal safety data, Marcus would later learn, had already flagged in 2 other pediatric patients, data that had been quietly omitted from the report submitted to the hospital's ethics board in order to keep the trial, and its funding, moving forward on schedule. Marcus performed CPR on his own daughter in a hallway outside the trial ward for 11 minutes before a code team took over, a detail that would haunt him for the rest of his life in ways he never fully found language for. Emily didn't survive the night. In the weeks that followed, as Marcus began asking pointed, increasingly furious questions about the trial's safety data, he found himself abruptly the subject of an internal review that concluded, with startling speed, that his own emotional state following his daughter's death had compromised his clinical judgment on two unrelated prior cases, a manufactured, paper-thin case built. Marcus would only understand much later, specifically to discredit him before he could take his concerns anywhere they might actually matter. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. The investigation, deliberately or not, never resolved into a formal charge, which meant it also never resolved into a formal clearance. Marcus simply hung, indefinitely, in a professional purgatory that made rehiring him anywhere in medicine functionally impossible, while the trial itself quietly continued under a different name and a slightly modified protocol, its funding and its chairman entirely undisturbed. Marcus didn't fight it, not really, not with anything left to fight with. Grief and fury and a gutting, specific guilt, the conviction that he, of all people, the doctor, the father who was supposed to know better than anyone how to protect her, had handed his daughter over to the very thing that killed her, collapsed his life in on itself with a speed that still surprised him, years later, whenever he let himself think about it clearly. There had been a version of those first months where friends and former colleagues still called, still checked in, still tried gently to pull him back towards something resembling stability, but Marcus found he couldn't sit across from any of them without seeing, reflected somewhere in their careful, sympathetic faces, the specific accusation he'd already leveled against himself 100 times over, that a father who understood medicine better than almost anyone had still somehow failed to protect the one patient who had ever actually mattered to him. He stopped answering the calls before the calls stopped coming, which felt, at the time, like the only honest thing left to do. He drank through the money first, then the apartment, then most of the relationships that might have caught him somewhere along the way, until eventually he simply stopped fighting the slide at all. For the last 4 years, Marcus Hale had lived on the streets within a few blocks of the one hospital he could never quite make himself leave entirely, sleeping in the alley behind the parking structure, eating at the shelter 2 streets over, watching the ambulance bay from a bench across the street more nights than he probably should have let himself admit, as if some part of him was still standing guard over a patient he'd already lost. The night everything changed began like most of his nights did, cold and unremarkable, until the ambulance bay doors burst open around him with the particular urgency Marcus's body still recognized instantly, a decade of instinct that grief and homelessness had never quite managed to erase. A little girl was wheeled in, seizing, her lips already tinged faintly blue, her mother sprinting alongside the gurney screaming a name, Ava, that meant nothing to Marcus in that moment beyond the raw terror in the woman's voice. He watched from his usual bench as the doors swung shut behind them, and told himself, the way he told himself most nights, that it wasn't his business anymore, that he'd forfeited the right to walk through those doors a long time ago. He told himself that for exactly 11 minutes, the same 11 minutes he'd once spent on his knees in a hospital hallway, before something in him simply stood up and walked inside anyway. By the time Marcus reached the trauma bay, security was already moving to intercept him, and the scene inside told him everything he needed to know before anyone said a word, a flat monitor line, a doctor stepping back from the bed, a mother sliding down the wall in the particular, boneless way grief moves through a body before the mind has caught up to what's happening. Marcus didn't stop at the doorway. He walked past the guards, past the attending physician, past everyone in that room too stunned by the moment to fully register what an unwashed stranger in soaked clothes was doing crossing their trauma bay, and stopped beside the little girl's bed. He looked at her for several seconds, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at anything clinically in 4 years, and something in his chest recognized the pattern before his conscious mind had finished naming it. The faint discoloration at her fingertips. The specific rigidity in her jaw that wasn't quite consistent with simple cardiac arrest. A residual tremor along her left hand that most people in that room, exhausted and grieving and moving too fast, hadn't had time to notice yet. He'd seen this exact combination before. He'd watched it happen to his own daughter. He leaned down and whispered 5 words, close enough that only the girl, in whatever thin margin of awareness might still remain, could have any hope of hearing them. "It's the same reaction, Gerald." The girl's father, standing frozen by the window, went rigid at the sound of his own first name coming from a stranger's mouth, and something in his expression shifted from grief into a very different, much older kind of fear. "Get him out of here," the attending physician snapped, finally finding her voice, gesturing sharply at security. But Marcus was already talking, fast and precise, the clinical cadence of 11 years of practice returning to his voice like it had never left, steadier than he had spoken to another human being in longer than he cared to count. "Check her potassium levels again, and get me the full drug list she's been given in the last 6 hours, all of it, including anything administered before she arrived. This isn't primary cardiac arrest. Look at her fingertips, look at the jaw rigidity, that's not consistent with what you're treating her for." The doctor, Renata Kim, hesitated for exactly as long as it took to actually look where Marcus was pointing, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite belief yet, but wasn't dismissal either. "Who are you?" she said, low and urgent, "and how do you know what you're looking at?" "I used to work here," Marcus said. 11 years, pediatric cardiac. "I'm telling you, if this is what I think it is, you have maybe 90 seconds before the window on reversing it closes. Please. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look. There is a particular kind of decision doctors sometimes have to make in emergency medicine, one that has nothing to do with credentials or protocol and everything to do with a split-second read of another person's certainty, and Renata Kim made hers in under 5 seconds, calling for the labs Marcus had requested even as security's hands closed around his arms to remove him. The results, rushed back in a little under 2 minutes, confirmed exactly what Marcus had suspected, a severe, dangerous electrolyte imbalance triggered by an adverse reaction to a medication combination the girl had been given earlier that evening, a reaction that mimicked cardiac arrest closely enough that it had nearly gone unrecognized entirely. Treatment reversed course within minutes. Eva Voss's heart, which had never actually stopped so much as been driven into a dangerous, chemically induced arrhythmia the monitors had misread, began to stabilize. She survived the night. But that, as it turned out, was only the beginning of the story, not the end of it. Gerald Voss found Marcus 2 days later, not through any dramatic search, but simply by asking the hospital's security office, with the particular flat authority of a man used to getting answers, exactly who the homeless man was who had walked uninvited into his daughter's trauma bay. What he found, cross-referenced against old hospital personnel records that hadn't quite finished purging his file, sent a very different kind of fear through him than the one he'd felt watching Ava's monitor flatline. Marcus Hale. Pediatric cardiac. Terminated 7 years ago, under circumstances Gerald himself had quietly, carefully engineered. He came to the shelter where Marcus had been staying since the hospital, technically against policy, had let him remain in a spare room near the ward while Ava recovered, ostensibly to answer follow-up questions about her case. Gerald stood in the doorway of that small room with an expression Marcus recognized immediately, because he'd worn something close to it himself, 7 years ago, in the moments right before his own life came apart. "You said my daughter's name," Marcus said, before Gerald could speak. "Which means you already know exactly why I said the words I said." Gerald's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Emily," he finally said, quiet, like the name itself cost him something. "I remember Emily. I'm sorry about what happened to her. I truly am. But you need to understand, whatever you think you saw in that trauma bay doesn't change the fact that you have no standing here, no license, no legal right to be anywhere near my daughter's care. I could have you removed from this building within the hour, and considering everything, I'd be well within my rights to do exactly that. You'd also be removing the only person in this building who's seen this exact reaction before," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything, Gerald. Not money, not my job back, not an apology. I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm telling you it's going to happen again if that follow-up protocol isn't pulled and reviewed properly this time, instead of quietly renamed and reissued the way it was after Emily. Something flickered behind Gerald's eyes at that, not quite guilt, not yet, but the particular unease of a man realizing a door he'd thought permanently sealed had just been forced open a crack. He left without answering, and for 3 days afterward, Marcus genuinely didn't know whether that silence meant the threat had passed or was simply gathering itself somewhere out of sight. What followed over the next several weeks was not the swift, satisfying reckoning either of them might once have imagined for this exact confrontation. Gerald Voss did not confess everything in a single dramatic scene. He denied, deflected, minimized, and twice threatened, through hospital counsel, to have Marcus removed from the property entirely and barred from any further contact with Ava or her care team, a threat that only made Renata Kim, who had spent the intervening weeks quietly reviewing everything Marcus had told her about the original trial, dig in harder rather than back away. She pulled the original safety reports from the trial's archived records, cross-referenced against the current follow-up study Ava had unknowingly been enrolled in through a standard cardiac monitoring program Gerald himself had approved as chairman years earlier, and found, buried in a data appendix nobody outside the original research team had likely read in years, the same drug combination, the same flagged reaction pattern, quietly present in the current protocol under a slightly different formulation name. The evidence, once it began surfacing, arrived from several directions at once, and none of it came from luck. A retired nurse named Paulette Sims, who had worked the trial ward 7 years earlier and had never quite made peace with what she'd been asked to leave out of her documentation at the time, came forward once she learned, through hospital gossip that traveled faster than any official channel, that Marcus Hale was back and asking questions again. She met him at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital, sliding a worn manila folder across the table before she'd even finished sitting down, as if she needed to hand it off before she lost her nerve. "I kept my real notes from that night," she said. "The ones before someone told me to revise the chart language. I told myself for years I kept them because I forgot to shred them. That was never true. I kept them because some part of me always knew somebody would eventually need to see what actually happened to your daughter." Her original, unaltered shift notes from the night Emily died matched precisely against the sanitized version that had made it into Emily's official chart, and the discrepancies were damning in exactly the specific, granular way that made them impossible to argue away as memory or error. A flagged adverse reaction in another trial patient, reported internally 4 days before Emily's enrollment, that had simply never made it into any document Marcus or the ethics board had ever been shown. Renata Kim's internal audit, meanwhile, traced the funding trail behind both the original trial and its current follow-up study directly back to a pharmaceutical partnership in which Gerald Voss held a substantial, undisclosed personal financial stake, a conflict of interest that should have disqualified him from chairing the Ethics Oversight Committee that had approved both studies, and had been concealed. Marcus and Renata eventually confirmed through the hospital's own compliance filings. Through a disclosure form Gerald had signed but that had somehow never been properly filed with the board. There was a small, ordinary detail that broke something open in Marcus during those difficult weeks, one that had nothing to do with lawyers or audits. Diane had begun quietly bringing Ava down to the hospital cafeteria during her recovery, mostly to give her daughter something resembling a normal routine amid the chaos surrounding her father, and on one of those afternoons, before Marcus had been formally barred from the grounds, Ava had ordered a chocolate pudding cup and eaten exactly half of it before declaring, with total 9-year-old seriousness, that she was saving the rest for later, in case later needs it more. It was such a small, specific thing, and it landed in Marcus's chest like a blow, because Emily had done precisely that, every single time, at that exact cafeteria, in that exact seat by the window, half a pudding cup, saved for a later that, for her, had eventually never come. He hadn't told Ava why he'd gone quiet at the table that day. He simply sat with her a little longer than usual, and let himself, for the first time in 7 years, feel the specific shape of missing his daughter without it flattening him entirely. There was a lowest point in the middle of all of it, a stretch of nearly 3 weeks during which Gerald's lawyers succeeded in having Marcus formally barred from the hospital grounds entirely, citing his lack of any current medical credential or legal standing in Ava's care, a technically accurate argument that nonetheless felt, to Marcus, Like watching the exact same machinery that had destroyed him 7 years earlier begin grinding forward again in real time. He sat outside the hospital's perimeter fence some nights, unable to get closer, watching the lit window he'd been told was Ava's room, wondering whether this fight, too, would simply outlast him the way the first one had, whether Gerald's lawyers and Gerald's money and 7 more years of careful paperwork might once again prove more durable than the truth, exactly the way it had the first time. Renata Kim, for her part, kept the audit moving quietly in the background, cross-referencing shift logs and safety appendices late into the evenings after her own shifts ended, driven by a frustration that had stopped being purely professional somewhere around the second week, though she never fully said so out loud. It was Ava herself, during a supervised visit her mother had quietly arranged against Gerald's explicit instructions, who changed the direction of everything that followed. Ava, 9 years old, had asked, the very first time she was lucid enough to form the question clearly, who the man was who had stayed in the room after everyone else had backed away. Nobody had quite known how to answer her honestly, until her mother, Diane, finally sat down and told her the truth as plainly as she could manage, that a stranger, a man who had once lost his own little girl, had refused to leave when everyone else had already given up. Ava had absorbed this with the particular gravity children sometimes bring to information adults assume is too complicated for them, and the next time she saw Marcus, brought quietly to a hospital cafe by her mother in defiance of her father's restrictions, she'd reached out and taken his hand without any hesitation at all. "You stayed," she said, "when everyone else left." Marcus, who had spent 7 years believing he had failed the one job that mattered most in his life, found he had no ready answer for that beyond holding her small hand a little tighter and telling her, honestly, that he'd never once considered doing anything else. It was that same visit, small and quiet and entirely outside anyone's legal proceedings, that gave Diane Voss the resolve to do what she'd apparently been considering for weeks without telling anyone. She came forward to hospital administration and, separately, to an independent journalist who had been quietly circling rumors about the trial's history for months, with her own internal knowledge of Gerald's financial stake in the drugs manufacturer, knowledge she had kept to herself out of loyalty to her marriage for years, until watching her daughter nearly die from the exact pattern of negligence that had once killed another man's child made that loyalty impossible to sustain any longer. With Paulette Sims's preserved shift notes, Renata Kim's audit trail, Diane's testimony, and the hospital's own buried compliance filings all converging into a single, coherent, well-documented account, the hospital board, facing a scandal now large enough that quiet containment was no longer a realistic option, launched a full independent review. Diane's decision to come forward had not been an easy one. She spent 2 sleepless nights before finally calling the journalist back, turning over in her mind every argument for staying silent that 7 years of marriage had trained her to reach for automatically, before deciding, finally, that the marriage itself was not worth protecting at the cost of another family someday losing what Marcus had already lost once. Gerald Voss was removed as chairman within the month, and the ensuing investigation, handled by state medical regulators rather than the hospital's own compromised internal process, formally cleared Marcus Hale's name of every allegation raised against him 7 years earlier, restoring his medical license in a ruling that noted, with unusual bluntness for a regulatory document, that the original disciplinary action against him appeared to have been initiated and pursued in a manner inconsistent with legitimate clinical concern. The reinstatement of his license did not, by itself, undo 7 years, and Marcus never pretended it did. He spent the following months in a transitional housing program, slowly rebuilding the ordinary infrastructure of a life he'd lost, an apartment, a bank account, a phone number people could actually reach him at, while Renata Kim, insistent that the department needed him back in some capacity long before any formal credentialing process would normally allow, arranged for him to consult informally on complex pediatric cardiac cases, an arrangement that gradually, over the better part of a year, became a formal staff position once his full reinstatement cleared. The reinstatement of his license did not, by itself, undo 7 years, and Marcus never pretended it did. He spent the following months in a transitional housing program, slowly rebuilding the ordinary infrastructure of a life he'd lost, an apartment, a bank account, a phone number people could actually reach him at, a process that felt, some days, almost as disorienting as the collapse itself had been. Small ordinary tasks like signing a lease or opening a checking account carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated after so many years without needing to manage any of it. Renata Kim, insistent that the department needed him back in some capacity long before any formal credentialing process would normally allow, arranged for him to consult informally on complex pediatric cardiac cases, an arrangement that gradually, over the better part of a year, became a formal staff position once his full reinstatement cleared. She never fully explained, even to Marcus, why she'd fought so hard for him beyond the case itself, though he suspected, without ever asking directly, that watching one doctor's career get quietly dismantled by exactly the kind of institutional cowardice she'd spent her own career trying not to practice had left a mark on her that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with the kind of physician she wanted to remain. Ava recovered fully, her father's downfall unfolding in the background of her own slow, steady return to an ordinary childhood, though the shape of her family afterward looked considerably different than it had before, her parents separated within the year, Diane choosing, in the aftermath of everything, to build a life independent of the Voss name entirely, a choice Ava, watching her mother's quiet, hard-won relief at the decision, seemed to understand far better than most children her age would have. There was one afternoon, not long after the regulatory ruling became public, when a reporter cornered Ava outside her school, hoping for a quote about her father, and Ava, 9 years old and entirely unrehearsed, had simply said, "The man who actually stayed and figured out what was wrong with me wasn't my dad. Maybe write about him instead." The reporter did, and the resulting profile, though never intended by anyone involved as a piece of vindication, ended up doing more to restore Marcus Hale's standing in the eyes of his former colleagues than the regulatory ruling itself had quietly managed. She kept visiting Marcus at the hospital long after her own treatment had concluded, sitting in the cafeteria some afternoons doing homework at a table near wherever he happened to be working, an arrangement neither of them had planned but that both had, somewhere along the way, come to depend on more than either fully admitted out loud. On the afternoons Marcus worked a difficult case, Ava learned to recognize the particular quiet that settled over him afterward, and had taken, without ever being asked, to sliding half a pudding cup across the table on exactly those days, an offering she never explained and he never questioned, because some things two people understand about each other don't require being said aloud to matter. It was nearly 2 years after that first terrible night in the trauma bay that Marcus finally told Ava the whole story, sitting across from her in that same cafeteria, about a little girl named Emily who had loved terrible puns and had once, at 6 years old, insisted on wearing a plastic stethoscope to school for an entire month because she'd announced she intended to be exactly like her father when she grew up. "I used to think saving you was some kind of do-over," Marcus admitted. "Like if I could just get it right this time, it would balance out what happened to her. It doesn't work that way. It never really evens out." Ava considered this with the same careful gravity she'd once used to ask who the stranger in her hospital room was. "Maybe it's not supposed to even out," she said. "Maybe you just get to keep being the kind of person who stays, even after everything. That still counts for something. I think it counts for a lot, actually." Marcus Hale, who had spent 7 years believing the worst day of his life had also been the day he stopped being worth anything to anyone, found he didn't have an argument sharp enough to disagree with a 9-year-old on that particular point, and didn't especially want one. He'd spent 7 years homeless outside a hospital he couldn't make himself leave, half convinced some part of him was still standing guard over a patient already lost. It turned out he'd been right to stay, just not for the reason grief had originally given him. He'd been waiting, without knowing it, for one more little girl who needed exactly the kind of watching only someone who had already lost everything once could still offer without flinching. On the 2nd anniversary of the night Ava was brought into the trauma bay, Renata Kim organized a small, quiet gathering in the pediatric cardiac unit's break room, nothing formal, just coffee and a cake somebody had picked up on the way in, an occasion Marcus hadn't fully understood the point of until Ava arrived with her mother and presented him, with great ceremony, with a small plastic stethoscope, the exact toy kind Emily had once insisted on wearing to school for a month. "Nurse Sims told me the story," Ava explained, watching his face carefully for a reaction. "I thought maybe you should have one too." In case you ever want to remember the good part instead of just the ending. Marcus held the small plastic toy for a long moment, turning it over the way Emily used to, and found that for the first time in 7 years, thinking about his daughter brought something closer to warmth than grief. "Thank you," he managed finally. "This is exactly the good part one needed to remember." If this story reminded you that the people the world walks past fastest are sometimes the ones paying the closest attention, remember it the next time you're tempted to look away from someone who doesn't look like they have anything left to offer, because you never really know which stranger might be the one still watching closely enough to catch what everyone else has already stopped looking for, or which 5 quiet words might still be worth everything it costs to say them.